Imagine losing everything overnight: your fortune, your possessions, and even your confidence in your own abilities. Now, imagine being able to rebuild everything from scratch, facing the worst moments of your life, and, against all odds, becoming a millionaire again. How did someone who fell so low find the strength to get back up? What drove them to keep going when all seemed lost? Prepare to discover a story of overcoming, perseverance, and transformation that will challenge your beliefs about what's possible after failure. Everyone knows the feeling of having a big dream. That idea that, if realized, could change your life forever. And when you start to see that dream come true, the feeling of victory is indescribable. The money starts flowing, doors open, and anything seems possible. You feel invincible. But what happens when that dream starts to crumble? When the ground crumbles beneath your feet, your self-confidence is tested, and ultimately, you find yourself at rock bottom. This was exactly what happened to one man, someone who had already tasted success, but who saw his life turned upside down in an unexpected and cruel way. He was at the top of his game. His business was thriving, and he had everything he'd ever dreamed of: luxurious homes, international travel, the admiration of many, and the respect of his peers. But, as life is unpredictable, he was unprepared for the storm that was to come. It all started with a financial miscalculation no one expected. A bold move, an impulsive decision that seemed promising at first, but quickly turned into a nightmare. Suddenly, what seemed like an unstoppable empire crumbled like a house of cards. The money disappeared, the businesses went bankrupt, and the people who had once admired him began to look at him with disdain and contempt. A sense of shame gripped his soul. How had he gone from hero to villain in such a short time? What few realize is that bankruptcy isn't just a financial loss. It goes beyond that. It profoundly affects the psychological, emotional, and self-esteem of those who face it. Each shattered dream becomes a painful wound, and with each day without finding a way out, the feeling of helplessness grows. Debts pile up, friends disappear, and you find yourself alone, staring into an endless abyss. What do you do when you're forced to start from scratch, but feel completely powerless? It was at this moment that he faced the greatest challenge of his life, the decision to continue or give up. But what happens when you refuse to give in? When failure doesn't define your destiny and you decide to bounce back, no matter how impossible it seems? This man's story isn't just one of bankruptcy. It's a journey of new beginnings, of overcoming obstacles, of courage, and of a search for redemption. It's about how a man, who saw his world crumble around him, found the strength to rebuild everything and become a millionaire again. But how did he do it? What changed his mindset? What lessons did he learn in those moments of despair that propelled him to success again? He could have resigned himself to failure. He could have lost himself in regret and guilt, surrendering to the idea that there was no way back. But instead, he rose. He took with him all the experiences he had lived, and used each one as a stepping stone to reach the top again. And it wasn't an easy journey. Doubt, fear, and insecurity accompanied him every step of the way. But he didn't give up. This man reinvented himself. He sought new ways of thinking, adopted a more strategic vision, and learned from his mistakes, which made all the difference. It wasn't just his money he regained, but a new way of living, thinking, and making decisions. He understood that the true secret to success isn't avoiding failures, but learning from them and moving forward with greater wisdom. And so, he began building his empire again. This time, however, with more prudence, more awareness, and a determination not to repeat the mistakes of the past. He used the pain of bankruptcy to strengthen his resilience and courage. And little by little, things began to change. Doors that had previously been closed began to open. The people who had judged him began to recognize him again, not as the man who lost everything, but as the one who had managed to bounce back. He, who had once been considered a failure, was now admired for his courage and determination. And that's the story we want to share with you. The story of an ordinary man who, after losing everything, found a new path and became a millionaire again. But the big question is, how did he do it? What did he learn? And what can you learn from this journey? If you've ever faced difficult times, experienced financial hardship, or even felt on the brink of collapse, know that you're not alone. We all go through difficult times, but what makes the difference is how we choose to respond. This man's story is proof that, with the right choices and a determined mind, anyone can bounce back. And that's what we'll cover in the next videos. How you can turn your struggles into fuel for success, how to learn from your mistakes, and how to reinvent yourself when all seems lost. Don't miss the next chapter of this inspiring journey. Now, if you were touched by this story and believe you can apply these lessons to your own life, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss future videos. Together, we'll learn how to overcome obstacles and achieve the life you deserve. See you in the next video. This is the development of the first topic with the emotional impact needed to engage your audience, generate curiosity, and set the stage for the next steps in the story. It also includes a CTA to encourage interaction and channel subscriptions. Everything seemed perfect. He was at the peak of his career, enjoying the rewards of years of hard work and dedication. The business he had built with his own hands was thriving. It was an empire. The future looked bright, with doors to success opening at every turn. The world was at his feet, and he, with a smile of satisfaction, believed that nothing could take it away from him. But as so often happens, fate had other plans. That day began like any other. The usual routine: a cup of coffee in the morning, a high-level meeting, an important contract to sign. But that morning, something felt different. An uncomfortable feeling. A tightness in his chest that he couldn't quite identify. He ignored it. After all, who would dare question their own luck at that moment? But the truth is, the first signs of decline were right there in front of him, disguised as opportunities. He had embarked on a new project, a bold expansion that seemed promising. A huge opportunity, they said. The kind of business that could catapult him even higher. But he wasn't seeing the bigger picture. Excitement about the possibility of growth blinded his vision. He dove in head first, with all his capital, believing he was building something even bigger. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to be in place. Cash flow seemed solid. The market was bullish. Confidence was high. But like an invisible storm, things slowly began to unravel. First came the contract that seemed assured. One of the most important partners decided to back out, citing new strategic directions. The impact was immediate. Money that should have come in simply didn't appear. But he believed it would be a temporary setback. He wasn't alarmed. He kept going, believing the tide would rise again, as it always had. Then came the other small problems. Suppliers who began delaying deliveries, dissatisfied customers who began questioning the quality of service, and finally, a financial miscalculation he didn't even realize until it was too late. The cost of expansion began to eat into his reserves faster than he could have imagined. Debts began to pile up, and what had once been a mountain of profits began to feel like a mountain of quicksand. Every step he took to stabilize the business seemed only to sink it deeper. And then came the most fatal blow: the loss of trust. That trust he had earned so hard, and which seemed to be the solid foundation on which his empire was built. Investors began to withdraw their support. Longtime partners began to drift away, and his reputation, built over years, began to crumble. He became completely isolated. There were no allies left. That enthusiasm in his eyes was gone. It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under him, and he had fallen off an endless cliff. But the worst was yet to come. At the height of the collapse, just as he was struggling to keep his doors open, an unexpected event accelerated everything. A financial scandal involving one of his key collaborators came to light. Although he was not directly to blame, the connection between the two was enough to embroil him in the chaos. The media quickly picked up on the story and portrayed him as a failed leader, deceived by a man he had trusted. His enemies began pointing fingers. The public image he had carefully cultivated was destroyed in the blink of an eye. He tried to resist. He tried to fight, trying to salvage what was left, but the tide of criticism was immense. His creditors began knocking on his door. The stress mounted daily. As a man who once had everything, he now found himself struggling to hold together the fragments of his life. The phone calls continued. The collection notices became constant, and the weight of responsibility fell on his shoulders like a ton. There was no room for error. It was in the midst of this that he had his first real brush with bankruptcy. It wasn't just a financial issue, but an identity crisis. The man who had once been admired and respected was now being looked down upon. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where to turn. His confidence had been replaced by insecurity, and his vision of the future, once bright, was now dark and directionless. But bankruptcy wasn't the end. It forced him to face the harsh reality of his situation and make a decision: keep fighting, or simply surrender to failure. He was at a breaking point. Shame, anger, and frustration weighed heavily on him. For a long time, he believed this moment would define his future forever, that he would never rise from where he was. But deep within his despair, a seed began to germinate, a small idea that maybe, just maybe, bankruptcy would be the opportunity for a new chance, a chance to learn from his mistakes and start over. But it was still too early to know what would come next. What he didn't know was that his real battle was just beginning. Recovery wouldn't be easy, but somehow he knew life still had something to offer, something that, looking back, he would understand as the key to his recovery. But how would he start over after losing everything? This is a story that is just beginning. And you, the viewer, will follow every step of this journey. The collapse was just the first chapter. What comes next may be even more surprising. This is the development of the story's second theme. It explores the details of the protagonist's downfall and how, little by little, his life fell apart, leading to a seemingly irreversible bankruptcy. But the story doesn't end here. On the contrary, the struggle to start over is just beginning. The nights grew longer, and the days heavier. The weight of defeat seemed to have seeped into every pore of his skin, crushing him from within. That feeling of being swallowed by his own failure was something he had never imagined he would experience. Bankruptcy wasn't just a financial loss. It was a wound that struck at his identity, his character, and everything he believed himself to be. The man who once walked with confidence could now barely lift his shoulders, as if an invisible shadow were constantly pulling him down. Lying in bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, he relived his moments of glory. He remembered the parties, the fancy dinners, the smiling faces around him, the applause and praise he always received. It all seemed so distant now. All that remained was the echo of his own doubts and the loneliness that enveloped him like a cold cloak. The first few days after the collapse were the most difficult. He received notice that his house would be repossessed. What had been his home, the place he had taken so much pride in, building, was now nothing more than an empty space, worthless. The doors that had once been open to him began to close one by one. He had to sell cars, clothes, valuables, everything that represented the lifestyle he had led. Each item he put up for sale was a deeper loss. Each sale was a stab in the chest. He remembered the meetings with investors, the trust everyone had in his judgment, the words of praise that would come when he signed the next big deal. Now, those same words were just a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. Shame began to creep into his mind. Shame for having been so audacious, for having believed the fortune would last forever, and for having overlooked the small warning signs that had appeared along the way. But the impact didn't stop there. His friends, the same ones who had once been by his side, began to drift away. Friendship is often measured by success, and the loss of status seems to be a relentless test for those who call themselves friends. The calls dwindled, the invitations to events disappeared, and little by little, he found himself with no one to count on. Loneliness became his only companion. The worst part was seeing the impact on his family. He, who had always prided himself on being the provider, now felt powerless. His wife, who had always been by his side, began to look at him differently. It wasn't anger, but a kind of quiet disillusionment. His children, who had previously seen him as a figure of success, now looked at him with a mixture of worry and insecurity. How could he explain to them that everything he had built was nothing more than a sandcastle? How could he teach his children the value of hard work when he himself had failed so miserably? The psychological suffering was something he wasn't prepared to face. He had grown accustomed to the applause, the praise, and the sense of control over his own life. But now, the emptiness was immense. He felt as if he were lost in a maze with no exit, where each wrong decision seemed only to lead him further away from the light. Guilt gripped his mind, and he began to ask himself, do I really deserve everything I lost? The weight of responsibility was there, immense, in every move he made. Collection meetings were even more difficult. Conversations with lawyers and creditors, which had previously been brief and direct, now became long and painful. Every no he heard seemed to be a reflection of what he already knew. He had failed. Not only himself, but all, those who trusted him. The most painful thing, however, was not the lost money, but the broken trust. Anger came next. A blind, unfocused rage. He wanted to blame someone, anyone, for his downfall. But deep down, he knew he had created the conditions for it. He looked at his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the man. His face was older, his eyes more tired, his posture weaker. But worst of all was the emptiness he felt inside. The man who had everything was now just an echo of himself, a shadow lost in the storm he had created. As the days passed, he found himself unable to sleep. Every thought that entered his mind was a reminder of the pain of defeat. What he believed impossible had happened. He was completely alone, with an uncertain future ahead of him. Every thought of starting over seemed like a lie, an empty consolation. And yet, he couldn't give up. There was something there, deep within his soul, that still screamed for a chance, for a way out, for a way to rebuild everything. But what he didn't yet know was that, in that moment of despair, he was about to learn something that would completely change his perception of himself and the world around him. He didn't know that the real struggle was just beginning, and that the pain of defeat, however unbearable, would be the key to a profound transformation. But to get there, he would have to do something that seemed impossible. Learn to deal with failure, and use it as strength to rise again. The suffering was still great, but a small flame of hope began to shine as he made a crucial decision. Not to give up. Not now. After months of uncertainty and sleepless nights, he finally made a decision that would change the course of his life. Not to give up. The pain of defeat still consumed him, but something inside him began to shift. He realized that, even at rock bottom, there was still something driving him forward. It was a silent force, something that came from within, something he hadn't recognized until then. He was tired of feeling powerless. He knew that if he didn't pick himself up now, the defeat would be even more crushing than any financial loss he might have experienced. It was at that moment that he decided to view failure not as an end, but as an opportunity in disguise. Failure didn't define him, but he knew that how he reacted to it could determine his future. Every mistake, every financial error, every strategic error that led him to that point was a lesson, and he was willing to learn from them all. At first, it was difficult. The first step was to face his own responsibility. He had to look in the mirror and ask himself, what did I do wrong? How did I get here? Instead of blaming circumstances, others, or luck, He took an honest look at his own failings. He began to see clearly where he'd made his biggest mistakes: overconfidence in success, a lack of long-term planning, the arrogance of thinking the top was a permanent destination. Each mistake he made seemed to repeat itself, until he finally understood the vicious cycle he was trapped in. He knew that to reinvent himself, he would first need to rebuild his mind. He began reading books, attending lectures, and connecting with people who had been through similar situations. But most importantly, he sought internal change. He no longer wanted to be the man who had been fooled by temporary success. He wanted to be someone who could weather any storm, someone who knew that, although life was unpredictable, he could be more resilient in the face of adversity. It was then that he made the decision to start from scratch, but in a completely different way. He knew he couldn't make the same mistakes. He decided not to follow the path of haste and the relentless pursuit of quick riches, but rather to adopt a more careful, strategic, and conscious approach. He began taking on smaller, simpler projects and building his foundation anew. Instead of aiming for immediate profits, he focused on learning and growing slowly and steadily. The hardest part was battling constant doubt. He wondered if he was truly on the right path. There were days when he felt discouraged, as if he were stuck, as if his recovery were a distant dream. But it was at this point that he began to realize something fundamental. The recovery process is not linear. There were ups and downs, but each small step forward brought him closer to what he wanted. He learned to celebrate the small victories. The first contract signed after bankruptcy, the first job opportunity that arose, the first time someone approached him for advice. These small moments began to rekindle his confidence and show him that he still had much to offer the world. As he gradually regained his financial stability, he also began to redefine his values. The pursuit of money was no longer his sole motivation. He began to value time, the quality of his personal relationships, and the importance of integrity. What he learned in the recovery process was that true wealth lay not in a bank balance, but in knowing that he had become a better, stronger, and wiser person than before. In this process of redefining himself, he also realized the importance of surrounding himself with the right people. During his rise, he had surrounded himself with many people who merely praised him, who were there only for the glow of success. Now, he wanted to be around people who challenged him, who offered him a broader perspective on the world and life. He learned that to achieve true success, he couldn't do it alone. The support of a network of trusted people was essential. But the greatest lesson of all was understanding that failure was not something to be feared. He knew that if he wanted to truly grow, he would have to accept failure as part of the process. Failure, in the end, was what had taught him more than any victory. He learned that it is in failure that we find our greatest lessons, and it is from failure that we find the true strength to grow. The pain of bankruptcy still haunted him, but now he saw it differently. It was no longer a bitter reminder of something lost, but a force that motivated him to be better, more strategic, and more conscious of the choices he made. He was building not only his new financial life, but also a new way of living. Now he knew that the biggest challenge wouldn't be earning his money back, but maintaining his inner peace, his dignity, and his ability to learn from what life had thrown at him. He didn't yet know where this would take him, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to move forward with renewed confidence and determination. He knew the future was still uncertain, but now he was prepared to face it, no longer with fear of failure, but with the conviction that he was stronger, wiser, and more capable than ever. The journey was far from over, but he had already taken the first step in the right direction. After months of reassessment and fresh starts, he felt stronger, more confident, and in some ways, more prepared for the future. But, as everyone knows, the journey to recovery is rarely a straight path. Just when he thought the road was clearer, unexpected challenges began to emerge, testing his resolve and will to move forward. The first major obstacle was the feeling of distrust from those around him. He was still rebuilding his reputation, and no matter how hard he tried to get back on his feet, the stigma of bankruptcy continued to haunt him. Longtime friends began to distance themselves, not because he had wronged them directly, but out of fear that the bankruptcy was a reflection of their own weaknesses. They began to doubt his ability to maintain long-term stability, and began distancing themselves, not out of malice, but out of caution. He could see the judgment in people's eyes. The unspoken words were there, floating in the air, and he felt the weight of the silent criticism that followed him wherever he went. Many, who had previously seen him as a model of success, began to question his choices, his business acumen, even his leadership abilities. He tried to hold his ground, but there were times when others' words shook him deeply. The fear that people were right, that perhaps he truly was no longer capable, began to creep into his mind. But the greatest challenge came not from outside, but from within. Doubts began to creep into his mind. He wondered if he was truly on the right path. There were days when mental fatigue became so intense that he was tempted to simply stop, to leave everything behind and accept that his life might never be the same again. The fear of repeating past mistakes haunted him constantly, and he struggled with the feeling that, no matter how hard he tried, he would never regain people's trust. On one of those difficult days, another unexpected challenge arose. He had begun working on a new business idea, something simple but promising. He had already begun, raising the necessary funds, and had a clear vision of how to get the project off the ground. But when he finally found the ideal partner to invest, a twist arose. The investor, who seemed to be key to the project's success, unexpectedly withdrew. He claimed a change of plans, leaving him once again alone, without the financial support he needed to take the next step. This blow was a shock, not only financially but emotionally. He felt as if he had been left behind again, as if fate were mocking him. He knew he needed an investor to move forward, but now he found himself without that crucial key. This setback not only cost him time and money, but also shook his confidence. The temptation to give up returned stronger than ever. He felt the weight of responsibility again, and had to fight the feeling that life was playing cruel tricks on him, as if recovery was always within reach, but never truly possible. He had to find strength where he didn't think he had any. One afternoon, in the midst of yet another bout of self-criticism, he remembered the words of an old mentor. True success isn't measured by how many times you fall, but by how many times you get up. Remembering this made him realize something important. He was beginning to forget the most precious lesson bankruptcy had taught him: resilience. He could no longer allow himself to succumb to the pressure of difficulties, and he knew that if he wanted to rebuild his life, he would need to be stronger than the obstacles that arose. Over time, he realized that to overcome difficulties, he needed to stop seeing obstacles as barriers, but rather as opportunities to learn and grow. Every criticism, every negative comment, every mistake became an opportunity to reinforce himself, to reaffirm his commitment to himself and his mission of starting over. He had to learn to pay less attention to what others said and focus more on what he needed to do to achieve his own vision of success. But the challenges didn't stop there. Even after finding new investors, his path was far from easy. Things began to improve financially, but a new obstacle emerged: lack of time. He was beginning to juggle multiple responsibilities, and he felt that, while he was regaining financial stability, his personal life was disintegrating. The time he spent with his family was decreasing, and the impact was palpable. His wife, who had always supported him, began demanding more attention, more presence. He knew he was distancing himself from his children, and that was a price he wasn't willing to pay. At that moment, he had to make another difficult decision. He needed to rebalance his life. Financial recovery was essential, but he knew that without a balanced personal life, he would lose more than he could gain. Bankruptcy had taught him that success without balance was not truly success, and he needed to find a path where he could succeed in business without sacrificing his family, friends, and his own well-being. He still had much to learn, but what he began to realize clearly was that the journey wasn't about the absence of obstacles, but about how to face them. There was no magic bullet to recovery, but he knew that with each challenge that arose, he became more prepared. He knew that the true measure of his strength would not be the absence of challenges, but how he dealt with them. Each new obstacle was a chance to prove to himself that, despite all he had lost, there was still much to gain. He was no longer just trying to recover. Now, he was building a stronger, more mature, and wiser version of himself. The journey was far from over, but each step brought him closer to what he'd always wanted. Not just to regain what he'd lost, but to achieve something deeper and more lasting. Something that, deep down, he knew no one could ever take from him again. He was no longer the same man. The path to this point, though arduous and painful, had transformed him. Every failure, every obstacle, and every small but significant victory had been essential ingredients in a profound shift in his mindset. He already knew that success didn't come from haste, but from perseverance. It didn't come from big bets, but from careful choices, constant learning, and resilience in times of crisis. But something was still missing. Something that would make all the difference. It was an ordinary morning, and he was back in his makeshift office. He no longer had the luxury of a large room overlooking the city, but that small space, surrounded by books and notes, seemed like the fertile ground where he would finally begin to plant the seeds for his future. Sitting there, his face illuminated only by the soft light streaming through the window, he reminisced about the days when he felt overconfident, when he believed success was within reach at any moment. But now, he felt calmer, more focused. It was during a conversation with a former business colleague, someone he had known at the height of his career and with whom he had lost touch during the bankruptcy, that the first spark was struck. This friend, who had also faced challenges and thrived, told him about a new sector that was gaining traction. A business area he had never considered, the digital market for small business solutions. The friend wasn't offering a direct path, but suggested he start investigating. The idea resonated deeply with him. Those words lit a light bulb in his mind. Small businesses were indeed growing, and many of them needed simple, affordable solutions to improve their management and increase sales. He began to reflect on all the tools and platforms he had used to structure his own businesses in the past. But he also remembered the difficulties he faced because he didn't have easy access to low-cost, highly efficient management tools. Perhaps, he thought, this was a niche that hadn't yet been completely saturated. From that moment on, an idea began to take shape in his mind. He didn't need to reinvent the wheel. Instead of trying to enter an industry where competition was overwhelming, he could create a solution that precisely met the needs of smaller companies that, like him, didn't have the luxury of large budgets, but needed technology and innovation to survive and grow. He remembered the hours he'd spent trying to understand how to optimize his own processes. How, in the midst of bankruptcy, he felt lost because he didn't have accessible tools to help him make smarter decisions. From this discovery, he dove headfirst into the digital market, studying trends, analyzing competitors, and identifying gaps in the market. He realized that many small business owners were willing to pay for tools that were simple to use, but also offered powerful features to optimize their businesses. He knew he no longer had the luxury of making large investments, so he decided to start small, testing the idea with a minimum viable version of his product. Most importantly, he began applying his own business philosophy to the development of this new idea. He didn't need a fortune to get started. He needed to focus on the real needs of small businesses and offer affordable, practical solutions. He spent hours and hours creating a simple but functional prototype. And, unlike his previous approach, he knew that this time he needed to listen to feedback from his early adopters before attempting to expand. He knew this initial validation was crucial. The real turning point came when he unpretentiously managed to get his prototype tested by a small group of local entrepreneurs. They began to realize the tool's value. The feedback was the proof he needed. The key to success wasn't offering a perfect product right away, but understanding people's real problems and building something that solved them effectively and practically. He wasn't trying to be the biggest, but the best in a specific niche. And that was enough to get started. What started as a simple idea quickly turned into a growing business. Over time, he recruited a small team, and together they began refining the product, improving its features, and offering personalized customer support. Every day, more companies were adopting his solution, and he began to see his revenue gradually increase. The most rewarding thing, however, was knowing that he was helping other entrepreneurs overcome the same challenges he had faced. Financial recovery finally seemed within reach. He wasn't just making back the money he'd lost, but he was building something more meaningful. He'd found the key to success. He wasn't trying to follow the traditional path, but rather innovating within a niche where he could make a real difference. He wasn't just managing businesses, but helping to create a community of entrepreneurs who, like him, had faced hardships, but were determined to keep going. Each step he took felt more confident. He no longer saw himself as the man who lost everything, but as someone who, through experience, had become smarter, more perceptive, and better able to see opportunities where before he saw only obstacles. He knew the journey was not yet complete, but each day he was closer to the goal. The turning point, then, didn't happen suddenly. It came with the patience of someone who learned from their mistakes, the determination to not give up in the face of challenges, and the wisdom that true success lay in finding a greater purpose in his work. He no longer needed the approval of others to validate his journey. The true value of what he had created was visible, not in the large numbers, but in the lives of the people he was impacting with his solutions. Now, he was truly ready for the next step. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that this time, he was ready to face it. The past, with all its pain and hardships, had been the soil where he had sown his future victory. And now, he was reaping the rewards of his perseverance and ability to reinvent himself. Now that the key to success was clear, he knew he couldn't make the same mistakes as in the past. That new project, which had started as a simple prototype, was growing steadily. But he didn't just want to regain what he'd lost. He wanted more. He wanted to create something lasting, something that was more than just a financial recovery. He wanted to build an empire that was solid, resilient, and, most importantly, founded on principles that would ensure its long-term stability. The construction of the new empire began gradually. He knew he couldn't rely solely on immediate success. The confidence he had lost in recent years couldn't be regained overnight. He had to learn to be more patient, more meticulous, and more cautious in his decisions. But at the same time, he didn't want to lose his ability to take risks, the same boldness that had made him so successful in the past. The first step was to rethink how he viewed money. When he was at the height of his initial fortune, he had been driven by the desire to achieve more, to prove himself superior. But now, he had a clearer vision of the value of what he did. Money should no longer be a goal, but a consequence of the positive impact his work had on the world. He knew that if his company were to offer real solutions and help small business owners thrive, profit would come naturally. The strategy was clear: create a sustainable and efficient business model based on simplicity, transparency, and real value. He began working with a small but highly qualified team, people who shared his vision and were willing to put their hands to work, even if the rewards took a while to arrive. The team, which had previously consisted of just a few people, soon expanded. They began building not just a product, but a culture within the company, one of constant learning, innovation, and ethical customer service. He implemented a policy of constant feedback, something he had neglected during his first entrepreneurial journey. Every client, every employee, every partner was listened to. He knew that lasting success didn't come from unilateral decisions, but from a collaborative effort, where everyone felt part of something bigger. Gradually, the company gained a reputation. The product was refined, and the number of customers increased. He focused not only on rapid growth, but on solid growth. He reviewed his financial processes with unprecedented precision, ensuring the company's sustainability even in difficult times. Learning. From failure led him to make more prudent decisions and avoid unnecessary risks, but without losing his ability to innovate. One of the most important lessons he took with him from his bankruptcy was the importance of diversification. The first time, he put all his chips on a single project. Now, he knew that success lay in having multiple revenue streams, in ensuring the company didn't rely on a single line of business to thrive. He began investing in new areas, always focusing on expanding his offerings, but never forgetting to maintain the quality and simplicity that had won over his first customers. He also focused on ensuring that the company's guiding values were clear and visible to everyone. Transparency and honesty were key. He knew that a lack of trust was one of the biggest causes of his previous bankruptcy, and now he wanted to build a company where trust was the foundation of all its operations. He always sought to stay ahead of the curve, anticipating his customers' needs, and adapting quickly to market changes. As the business grew, he felt more comfortable reinvesting profits, not only in the company's growth, but also in himself. He began seeking mentorships, joining entrepreneurial groups, and connecting with people who challenged him intellectually. He no longer wanted to be the man who made decisions alone, without considering all the possibilities. He knew that, now, his emotional intelligence and his ability to learn from others were as important as his ability to generate profits. Over time, the achievements began to pile up. What once seemed like a distant dream was now becoming a reality. The company was growing rapidly, but he didn't let success go to his head. He knew that confidence could easily be destroyed, and that humility would be his greatest asset. Each new contract signed, each new client acquired, was treated with the same seriousness and commitment as the first. He knew that to sustain the empire he was creating, he would need to continue acting with the same discipline and vision that had gotten him there. The moment he realized he was truly regaining his wealth came when he finally looked at the numbers and realized that, in just 2 years, he had overcome the financial loss he had suffered. It wasn't just the amount of money he had recovered, but the impact his company was having on the market. He was helping small business owners grow and prosper, and that gave him deep satisfaction. He knew that this time, empire building wasn't a mad dash, but a careful, strategic process. The empire he was creating was not just a reflection of his ability to generate wealth, but an expression of his evolution as a person and an entrepreneur. He had learned to be more than just a businessman. He had become someone who understood the true foundations of success, not the accumulation of wealth, but the creation of something meaningful and lasting that impacted the lives of those around him. The new empire was not based solely on profit, but on the ability to transform lives, including his own. The journey was far from easy, but rebuilding his wealth was only part of the great transformation he had experienced. He knew that true wealth now lay in the balance he had achieved, the learning he had absorbed, and the person he had become. And with that, he was more than prepared for whatever challenges life might bring. The empire was no longer a matter of being a millionaire, but of being able to create something that would endure for generations. Finally, he had achieved what seemed impossible, a return to millionaire status. But unlike the first time, this time the achievement wasn't accompanied by euphoria or arrogance. He looked in the mirror, now reflecting a different man, more mature, more centered, and above all, more aware of what truly mattered. Victory was no longer just about the numbers in his bank account or the display of material possessions. The true victory lay in the transformation he had experienced throughout his journey. The man who began rebuilding his life after bankruptcy was no longer the man who once believed success was synonymous with luxury and prestige. He had learned the hard way that true strength lies in how you get back up after you fall. He learned that failure is not the end, but the beginning of a new journey, and that the most valuable path to success is not paved with easy victories, but with mistakes, learning, and above all, the humility to recognize that nothing is permanent. When he looked back on all the moments of pain, the sleepless nights, the days of despair, he no longer saw failure. He saw growth. He saw wisdom gained from every stumble, every wrong decision, and every moment he thought he couldn't go on. What seemed like the end was actually the starting point for the person he became. Now, as he looked at his renewed empire, he didn't just see material prosperity. He saw something much deeper. He saw the positive impact his company had on the lives of others. He saw the families who depended on the success of his businesses, the entrepreneurs he helped thrive, and the stories of resilience that resonated with each satisfied customer. He knew that by creating something meaningful, he had created a legacy, and that legacy was far more valuable than any number in a bank account. He also reflected on the values he now carried with him: integrity, resilience, and the importance of continuous learning. He understood that business isn't just about making money, but about creating value, impacting lives, and being a positive force in the world. Failure taught him to be more cautious, but also more audacious in different ways, not rushing, but with the courage to innovate and pursue new opportunities. He knew that true success wasn't measured by what you achieve, but by the impact you leave and the people you help rise up. Now, more than ever, he understood that his true victory lay not in achieving wealth, but in the ability to remain true to his principles, committed to his purpose, and grateful for every step of the way. Bankruptcy taught him to appreciate every small success, every client he won, every day of hard work. He knew that nothing would have been possible without the mistakes that led him to reinvent himself. Bankruptcy, far from being his end, was the key to his true transformation. And it's this transformation that he now carries as a story of inspiration. No matter where you are on your path, no matter how distant success seems, the most important thing is to never lose hope. Never stop believing in your ability to start over. A man's journey is defined not only by the highs, but also by the lows. And in the end, it's the lows that truly shape who we are. He knew that the future was now in his hands. With the experience he had gained, he was better prepared to continue growing, not only financially, but as a human being. He was grateful for everything he had experienced, for the lessons failure had taught him, and for the immense learning he had gained back to the top. Now, he was ready to help others understand that failure doesn't define the end of anything. It's just a step on the path to a new victory. And above all, he knew that the journey never ends. There's always more to learn, more to build, more to achieve. If you were inspired by this story of overcoming and transformation, if you believe that change is within your reach, don't hesitate to take the first step. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell for more inspiring stories and tips that will help you transform your life. Never forget, success is built with perseverance and gratitude. We're on this journey together. Let's continue to grow and learn together.